So ice rink tomorrow.
Oh, yeah.
I don't admonish some people.
There's a big incident happened days ago.
That the
Police report it. (6:31). Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Public Works Committee. All trustees are accounted for. And tonight we have two agenda items. The first agenda item being Capitol Drive Pedestrian Safety Enhancement Initiative, review of the 2025 initiative items. As our presenter tonight, we have Leanne Bushlick, Director of Public Works. Leanne, could you run us through this particular agenda item?
Certainly. Recall we reviewed this request initiative form, I believe it was in May of 2024. And the initiative was in response to a 2023 traffic and parking regulation program request that identified 13 different items, a variety of which were acted upon, some of which were not. And this initiative was intended to continue the review of those items that had not been completed and determine which of those would move forward, potentially with the recommendation from the Public Works Committee and a request for funding in a future budget. So my attempt to summarize really identified three points that the committee agreed upon in May. And those were to consider the outstanding request to the Wisconsin Department of Transportation. It should be Bureau of Traffic Operations to advance the speed limit reduction request. And we can go over that in more detail in just a moment. The second item is to develop direction to staff regarding pavement marking frequency and type. Marking of the crosswalks was one of the requests identified in that 2023 taper submission. And then the third is to consider modifications to existing streetscape to improve visibility. That is a summary, sort of encapsulates a number of different items in that request related to both potential hardscape improvements, bump outs, et cetera, and possible vegetative changes in the corridor. So those are the three larger areas of discussion. The memo included a summary table that identified each of the requests that was submitted and then kind of where we stand to date. It wasn't really my intention to go through each one of those, but I am happy to answer any questions if anyone has questions on status of items 1 through 13.
Do any of the trustees present have questions about any of the 13 requests or the 3 that are proposed?
I did have a question about the request for repainting. Was that a citizen request or was that a DPW suggestion?
No, that was part of the 13 individual requests that made up that 2023 taper submission.
Okay.
Taper is my shorthand for traffic and parking regulation program.
I'm looking at this, trying to look at this from a little bit of a different perspective. And it comes to me that these are, the citizen concerns and they brought them forth. But I wonder, and this is probably a larger question for Director Griepentrag and yourself, Rebecca and Chris, if staff had any recommendation to improve bike and pedestrian safety on West Capitol Drive, what would that look like? Would it look like this? Would it look different? And would it work for us? My second question is a little unrelated. are we working with the state? Are we working with Darren Madison? I feel like without knowing how the Wisconsin Department of Transportation operates, which I don't, nor do I really want to know, but I feel like I need to know. How can we improve what we're doing? This is all the citizen input, and it's now going to be 2 years old. And we're just now looking at how we can try to move forward with it. And I'm thinking, okay, feeling frustrated, the citizen input items. I understand we're working in a government. This is not a private business. Things go slowly. But if we could make this more collaborative with staff and with the state, would that help?
I- I'm not sure what you mean by more collaborative. Our DPW staff has had ongoing conversations with Department of Transportation related to this. I mean, as part of my kind of refreshing my memory on this, I went through dozens and dozens of emails with state staffers regarding these 13 individual requests. So I would categorize our current relationship as collaborative. It's not collaborative in the public arena, but significant back and forth conversations about how we proceed on some of these items, given that this is not a local road. It is a connecting highway. The village has some degree of autonomy in how it is operated and regulated, but that's some degree. At the end of the day, it's a state highway, and we are required to abide by the guidance and the regulations that the state has in place for how its highways are operated and governed.
It's just a quick, the autonomy. Can you describe, so we've talked about this drive with, can you talk about like autonomy? What are we able to do, to not do? What do we have to go to them for? And that probably a lot longer. And so I would appreciate the ability to read it at some point, but I don't feel like I fully understand where the lines are on what we can just say, nope, this is what we're going to do forward. And, oh, we need to go do a deal. But again, I don't need the answer now.
Yeah, I mean, I just generally, I would say anything that impacts the operation of the roadway, ultimately, DOT has the final say on that.
Seems super vague.
Yeah, it is. It also encompasses most of what is involved in, what we would think about changing in the,
So fair to say that it's anything curb to curb?
yeah, I think that would be fair. We have a certain amount of leeway in each of those items, but anything, for instance, anything that changes the geometry of the roadway. So you want to put in a bump out, you want to add a crosswalk, you want to introduce a pedestrian refuge, anything like that would ultimately have to be approved by the department. If we wanted to undertake lighting improvements or a streetscape project, they would have very little interest in governing those types of activities.
Okay, so I mean, moving forward, I think it would be helpful for me. There was some sort of guidance, what we can play with and what we can't.
Does that exist?
I believe this is maybe
It probably doesn't exist in a nice, neat little package like we would like it to, but it definitely exists. It
Okay.
may take me some time to call it from the various places that it is and put it in some type of deliverable that's useful.
Okay.
I think that would be
I think it
valuable.
would be helpful
Yeah.
for us to be able to say
I agree.
amongst ourselves and citizens, this we can do in a
Mhm.
fashion and timeline that relatively quick, given our constraints. And then this is what we have, what we would propose, but would have. That would be.
Can definitely do that.
And then what's the
I'm
formal process
Could I,
for?
I'm sorry, do you mind holding that just for a moment?
Okay.
Trustee Stokebrand, just to go back to your earlier comment question, we had those 13 items. The items that we could move on or act on without engineering work and or without a budget allocation, we did.
Grateful for that. I think the RFBs are great. Added, very grateful for all of that. From trim to tree.
I apologize.
I just,
No,
if
it's fine.
staff has a better idea of things that would improve, anything beyond group came up with, or does the state ever come and say, I guess my question is, like, without someone being killed, which would get everybody, suddenly I'm guessing everybody would come to the table. If we can do something before that happened, what would the state, what does Public Works suggest that we do to slow traffic down? And maybe this is a discussion for public safety with the Chief Worth. Targeted patrols is always overtime, is my understanding. Do we want to, look at a different staffing model for police so we can do direct targeted patrols without overtime? That's a big decision. That's a big discussion.
It is. I think my personal opinion would be that we are, we're approaching max on what we can do from an engineering standpoint. When we have these conversations, someone once early in my career explained it to me as a three-legged stool, and they're all E's. You have engineering, you have education, and you have enforcement. And the stool doesn't stand if they aren't all equally used, right? And I would argue that at this particular point in time, our stool is not level. We have a lot of work that we can do on education, and my personal opinion is we have a lot of work that we can do on enforcement. There are limited opportunities left in the engineering realm. That's not to say there are none, but they are limited.
So what about narrowing from 15 to 11 and the dedicated bike?
We don't have any 15-foot significant length traffic lanes. There might be areas where that lane is 15 feet, but for the most part, those lanes are 11 to 12, and that is absolutely and strictly regulated by WSDOT. That is a major arterial and a trucking route, and there's absolutely zero way they will ever approve reducing that anything less than 11. Not going to happen.
Are we able to add bike lanes to, or at least better markings for a bike lane to that, the area on Capitol?
Possibly. When that road was designed and engineered, there bike lanes or bike accommodations did not exist prior to 2010. Those were added as part of the 2010 reconstruction. Bike lanes was a requirement at the time that WSDOT said we are putting in bike lanes. That wasn't necessarily a village request. There may have been interested parties in the village that were very supportive of bike lanes, but that directive did not come from the village board. That was a WSDOT bike and ped directive. There are not full 5-foot bike lanes in the corridor in all areas because they did not fit. To put 5-foot bike lanes in every location would have required some additional, as I recall, and my memory isn't always outstanding, but my recollection is that there would have been additional property purchase, right-of-way purchase that would have been required, and or significant changes to our existing storm sewer and combined sewer infrastructure. People tend to think, let's just widen the road. Well, we'll just, we're taking the curb out anyway, we'll just move it back. Yeah, except everywhere you have a catch basin, you now have to entirely replace that structure, replace the lead that went from that structure to the storm sewer. That adds up fast and that number climbs quickly. And so in the interest of that, oftentimes people work within existing curb limits. So I think that probably did play into that decision in 2010. But I think there was also a component of not enough right-of-way in all cases to accommodate a full bike lane
Hmm.
on both sides.
Thank you for that clarification.
I did have a question about the, possibility of doing bump outs or something along those lines, which I understand DOT would have to approve, but they've done it on Capitol Drive all throughout the city of Milwaukee, like around 50th and Capitol, there's bump outs. So my question is, how would the village go about making that request to see if we could get that approved?
I have a two-part answer. So the first answer is, my understanding is the village would have to provide an engineered drawing, so engineering plans for the installation of a proposed bump outs, and that would be submitted to the Bureau of Traffic Operations for their review and approval. My second part to that is there are, as I recall, there are 2, possibly 3 locations that the addition of a bump out is feasible. You cannot put bump outs on the south side of the roadway because there is no parking on the south side of the roadway. The curb lane is a bike lane. If you put a bump out in there, you've removed the bike lane. So that is not feasible.
Well,
Would it be
like the
pop-
painted bike lane, like the stripe?
Or would it be
So would
possible to
that-
put a bump out? Sorry.
Just let me, so DOT wouldn't approve that? Is that what you're saying?
They would not approve it, and I would strongly recommend that you didn't do it because you would eliminate the bike lane by installing bump outs. On the south side of Capitol Drive, there's the curb, there's the bike lane, and there's a traffic lane. There's no parking. And typically when we see bump outs, they encroach into the parking lane and push that curb right up against the edge of the traffic lane, provide that extra refuge for the pedestrian. You don't have that option on the south side of the road.
Okay,
It's
well, there's,
impossible.
possibly there's other things that
Yeah.
slow traffic down.
The thing that comes to my mind off of Mr. McGovern's point is bump outs that now exist. South Lake Drive. Curb, the bike lane out, and they've just carved out.
But you don't have, they previously had parking there. We have a
They have
curb,
So we couldn't
They have
slide
extra
those.
No.
space.
you'd encroach into the traffic lane. There is no.
I'll take another look. Okay.
Yeah, so it goes curb, bike lane, traffic lane, traffic.
And it's a small bike lane. It's not like
It's 4 feet.
it's
So
4
if
feet. It's not,
Any bump out on the south side of the roadway
Okay.
would eliminate the bike lane.
Well, take a look.
There are 2 to 3 options on the north side of the roadway that don't currently have a bump out. In that particular location, when we did the design, we tried to identify key intersections that were going to be used by students when they decide to actually use a crosswalk, which the vast majority of time, in my experience, is not what I observe. So we do have the bump outs, I believe, at Bartlett, at Wood, no. Larkin, and then the entrance to the stadium. Newhall.
Yep.
We did not put them at the other intersections because they weren't identified, those weren't identified to be significant crossing destination. But they could be added.
How many intersections would that, both in east and west side of, be like 2, you said Newell maybe?
Yeah, I prefer not to answer that
Okay.
question on the fly.
Okay.
I can certainly, that's going to be something that we're going to be talking about. So if you don't mind, you'll permit me just to, we can
you want to
jump
jump
ahead.
to,
No, not to number 2, but the memo also includes a very preliminary timetable of discussions of items. So the intent is that your next meeting on the 22nd, you are going to know more than you ever wanted to about pavement markings, because we're going to
I'm excited about
deep
that.
dive into pavement markings. Then the following meeting, which would be the first meeting in February, is when we will talk about options and opportunities for modifications to the streetscape, including roadway modifications and potential additional signage. After that, well, and I'm also going to throw some options at you for the vegetative streetscape changes, which we have some opportunities, I think, to significantly improve some of the sight lines. To this point, we've just sort of been hacking things down to 6-8 inches, which, isn't the intended height of those plantings. So if we can kind of check all the boxes and clean some of that up, I have some modifications, with your permission, that I'd like to do to streetscape that I think not only would improve visibility, but would probably reduce our maintenance costs.
Would what?
Reduce our maintenance costs.
Swap out species.
And in some areas directly adjacent to crosswalks, personally, I think it's more appropriate that it's turf grass rather than actual plantings. We just eliminate all of those potential options for sight line issues. And oftentimes when we have plantings right up against those crosswalks through the medians, when people or machinery don't stay on the crosswalk, the plants suffer, and they really don't look the way they should look.
Thank you. Now, I do believe that over the course of my time here on Public Works, I mean, we've made slow inroads, we've made small steps, and I know it's not what everybody wants, but I have seen changes, and I look forward to all these items coming up here over the next couple months, which I do think some will make a pretty big impact. Before we move on, be happy to take any comments from the public. Please. Yeah, maybe I can help you.
I don't know, those mics are picking up everything.
It's just better for the people that are listening online to hear you.
Sure. Good evening, friends. Sandy Pendleton, 3529 North Frederick Avenue. First, thank you for your service. I'm not here to win any arguments. I'm not here to make enemies, certainly. I do have some suggestions. I'm not going to repeat what I put in my written comments to you. I thank you all for your service and the folks who reviewed that and got back to me. I really appreciate that. As I mentioned in that letter, lane width diets, there's several reasons why that's a long shot. Under the traditional rules, truck route, bus route, and the fact that we're in a northern climate that gets snow. If I was sitting down with Deb Tarnow with the Wisconsin Department of Transportation, I would really like to have a discussion with her and say, we see what's happening in Milwaukee with, Lake Drive and other places. It seems like the traditional rules are being set aside and progress is being made. Is this one of those traditional rules that there's more flexibility now, or can we look at this in a more creative way? So again, it's a long shot, but given what's happened on Lake Drive, south of Milwaukee, quite dramatic changes from what we've seen before, maybe this is the time to sit down with Deborah and other folks who want to see improvements in safety for vulnerable road users with the state, and there are many. It's not the old Governor Walker Department of Transportation in Madison anymore by any means. So I would still, even if it's a long shot, try to have that conversation with the DOT to work collaboratively with them to see what's possible. On the issue of marking bike lanes, as I understand it, and again, I'm not a traffic engineer. I don't pretend to be a traffic engineer, but my understanding is when we have a 4-foot wide area, right now, defined on the south side by a fog line. We could mark that as a formal bike lane if it's next to the curb. And on the south side of Capitol, that 4-foot bike lane is next to the curb, except for that small area just south of, just west of the intersection of Morris and Oakland. There's 3 or 4 parking spaces there, and there's a bus stop there. So we couldn't mark that area with the bike lane symbol. But everything in front of the high school, everything in front of that gas station up to Oakland, we could mark as a bike lane under the current rules with the state. If you look at section 3.4 of the Wisconsin Bicycle Facilities Handbook, it allows that. On the other side, the north side of Capitol, we've got something like 35 parking spaces there. So we would not be able, and they're already small parking with parking spaces. I think there's 7 feet, something like that on the cross section there. We could not mark those at this time unless we were to get changes in the lane width. And I'm not talking about changing any curves right now because of that's just not in the cards. We're not in a reconstruction period on Capitol Drive right now. I agree with Leanne that at Morris, which is kind of the key intersection that we're really concerned about pedestrian safety, student safety there, our options, our opportunities for bump outs there are quite limited. But I do think where we can, those 2 or 3 places where Leanne said, yeah, maybe it's possible with those. I do think we should be looking at those because ultimately we want to calm traffic on Capitol Drive. We've unfortunately allowed Capitol Drive to become a Strode, or what some of my more radical friends refer to as a car sewer. And we are just allowing traffic to move on that stretch in a unsafe speed in a school zone. So there are some things we could do from an engineering standpoint. I totally agree with the 3-legged stool that Ann identified. There are some options we can do, such as the signage, advanced signage and RRFB options that I mentioned in my letter. Or, I think if, God forbid, we have that instance where a child is seriously injured or hurt on Capitol Drive, we're going to be looking at hawk crossings that, when this pedestrian activates that, there's over the street red lights flashing so that traffic comes to a halt. Right now, my subjective observation is that too many drivers on Capitol Drive aren't paying attention to RRFBs when the pedestrians activate them. And we may need to move to other engineering options to increase that compliance. So thank you for considering my comments. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Sandy. Are we moving on to? I know it's getting close to 7 o'clock, so we will, let's do it. If that's all right with everybody, we can move on to the second agenda item, which is to consider requests to advance speed limit reduction.
So you'll recall the board funded a speed data collection study. That data was collected by Strand. Strand applied the data to the existing TOPS guidance from the Wisconsin Department of Transportation. And when they submitted that study to us, the deliverable stated that based on their understanding of that guidance, it was unlikely that the Department of Transportation was going to grant the request to reduce the speed limit. There was some conversation at the time about whether the data was collected appropriately or properly, I should say. I did have multiple conversations with reps at WSDOT, and they agreed that the approach that Strand took and the data that was collected, both time and place, was done properly and it met the existing guidance requirements. The ruling from the safety and the Southeast Region Safety and Regulations Unit, which is the unit that Deb Tarnow is with, did review our request and found that the guidance did not support reduction of the speed limit. But they did advise the village that that request could be advanced to the Bureau of Traffic Operations, which, if you consider sort of WISDOT to be a pyramid, that really would be the top of that pyramid. And the village could choose to advance that request. I'm going to use the word appeal, but that's not officially what's happening. It's an advancement of the initial request. We didn't take any action at the time. And really what this ask of you is for your consideration as to whether we want to just kind of check that box. I think personally, it's unlikely that we're going to get a different answer. But we would then be able to say, as a village government unit, that we took every action within the WISDOT process to make that request and have that request heard.
Is the process for you a simple email with corresponding just materials?
It is. It would be a relatively easy thing to put together and do.
I mean, I feel personally, I feel like it's worth, it's worthwhile just sending out that email to see what kind of response we can get so we can make sure that we've done all we can. Do I think it would help? The street in general, probably not so much, but I do feel that this is something that our residents have been asking for and it can't hurt. Trustees?
I'm in the same boat. I mean, I don't think that reducing the speed is going to do anything with speed on the road. But if it, somewhere down the road gives us another tool in our toolbox, or especially given it takes.
I kind of have similar views unless there's some downside to us submitting it, even if they're probably going to reject it. I feel like we should probably send it.
Okay.
You have the direction you need?
I believe I do.
Fantastic. Wonderful. With that, I would take a motion to adjourn.
To adjourn.
Second.
We are adjourned at 7:03.
And at 7:03, I'll call to order the Community and Business Relations Committee, all members present. Like 3 minutes of our time, DPW.
Pride.
We have 2 items for discussion this evening. If possible, I'd like to just flip-flop them real quick. I think the street closures will probably be relatively fast. And then we can talk about the DPW site.
Yep, I'm open.
With no objection. Okay. So can we just run through? I mean, I know that we discussed, I brought up potential closure of certain streets during trick or treat. And I know we sort of that night kicked it to this committee. Anything else we should know on background or?
No, in fact, I wasn't in attendance at the meeting, I think, when this was requested as a future consideration. And so just because I just wanted a starting point to see.
Yeah, I think what happened is that we were just discussing trick or treat. We were discussing, it came up during discussion of their safety initiative around the village with the traffic. And then I think I mentioned how busy some of the streets are during trick or treat. Most notably, based on my experience, Morris Boulevard, Capitol. And so it was like, oh, well, let's potentially discuss our ability to close certain streets in 2025 during trick or treat hours so that they were much safer than they have been. Having grown up on that street, having parents that live on that street right now, I know other trustees live in and around the street. It is unbelievably busy during trick or treat and unbelievably unsafe with kids running back and forth. Like at this point, I do not know how someone hasn't been hit by a car.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the genesis of all of this. And so I would very much like to entertain, and it doesn't have to be right away, but our options as they relate to closing streets. And it doesn't have to just be Morris, right? I mean, there are other blocks in the community that have a ton of children on them. They're Woodburn, Alpine, Maryland. I mean, just to name a few, just a ton of kids. And I know we don't do nighttime trick or treating. Maybe we can tackle that somewhere down the road. But for daytime trick or treating, most specifically on Morris, was my thought.
Yeah, so I live on Morris and I hand out candy every year, and it is it's a sustained multiple hour sort of hundreds of kids, hundreds of families sort of party. I mean, not party. I mean, it's fun. I mean,
It's what it's supposed to be, right?
yeah,
Like,
it's a good time, but it is extremely dangerous. When there's cars parked on both sides, sometimes parking the driveways in on Morris, when there's two cars parked on both sides, it's really hard for cars to kind of get past each other. And there's cars that try to go at high speeds. There's cars that stop in the middle of the road to let kids out and just hang out there. And there's kids constantly jetting back and forth. I would love to see what this proposal looks like or what we could do. But at the same time, where does that put those cars and the traffic? It's going to put those people, it's going to put all of that somewhere else.
sure.
Right. So if it's not on Morris, it's going to be on Woodburn. It's going to be on the next street over or somewhere else or who knows where it's going to go. But I would be open to figuring out ways to make this a safer sort of environment during that time and something that's more conducive to children running around, because that's what we have. And it is extremely dangerous. And I agree. I'm shocked nobody's been hit by a car yet.
It's great to watch. It's just dangerous.
Yeah.
So figure something out.
Yeah, and I agree that we should consider making it more open to other blocks on the village. I know some people do this kind of informally where they just request a permit to do a block party that week, and then they weekend or that day, I guess, and have a little neighborhood get together. So I think it's just a nice thing to kind of for safety and to build community in Shorewood. And maybe we could try to sort of educate people that if you're going to come to Shorewood or drive in Shorewood, just park the car and get out and go.
Yeah, I
where you
mean-
park. So I think it's manageable and something we should go for.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, so just for some background information that we can process later. And this was in place when I started. I had nothing to do with this, but there is a list of streets that are not eligible for closure for block parties. That's typically your primary collectors and arterials. Morris is on that list. So at one point in time, it was determined that from a traffic standpoint, the closure of Morris would present issues to surrounding streets. So just background information.
Something that was legislated in that we could legislate out if we want. Not something that's determined by WSDOT or anything like that.
No, not WSDOT, but when you look at sort of your traffic movement framework, Morris is a big piece in that puzzle.
Yeah.
So it goes back to if you don't allow cars there, we have to think hard through the impacts of that on surrounding streets.
I get it. I would still like to look at it. I mean, I think that block parties in my mind is an all day, all night thing, which it has a larger footprint than 3 hours of trick or treat. So I duly noted that it could potentially cause problems. I don't, having grown up on that block, I don't see anything we can't, mount.
How much of Morris? The entire-
TBD.
The entire length of it?
I would say probably when I thought about this, I'd probably say, is it Elmdale? What's the first?
Elmdale's the first
The
block.
first, I'd say
Yeah.
from Elmdale, because from Elmdale all the way to Olive, probably.
A good chunk of the whole block.
It is a good chunk. And the thing is, those with emergency services that if, say, God forbid, they have to get somewhere,
Mhm.
I don't think they would make that turn on Elmdale. Unless,
And
also trying to get in there.
I would strongly suggest if you're going to close it, not at Elmdale, at
At
Capitol.
At Capitol.
Because otherwise you have all these
Just
vehicles.
going to
are
a
gonna-
quarter of one block and then you're going to the
And they're going to
alleys.
turn right.
Yeah, I just
Or-
thought about that to kind of let the traffic, yeah,
But
probably makes a lot of sense.
again, this is January. We've got some time, but I would like to have a conversation potentially with fire, with police.
Yeah.
DPW, and just see what options are on the table. In a formal setting, in a committee setting.
Correct.
Go from
And
there.
length would help.
One year,
that as well.
the police officer was out there kind of helping direct things, and that was incredibly helpful. Like that, I feel like things were just like so much, more manageable when there was an officer out there. Is that reasonable every single time? I mean, I don't know. I mean, but that kind of helped things, move along easier. And also, we want to be a welcoming community. We don't want to have a police officer out. It just kind of, it's just not a really welcoming look.
Yeah, I mean, we have plenty of others
Yep.
that you can park on, that you can walk a block.
Correct. But if we're also going to open it up to other arterials like Maryland, Murray, Kensington,
Again.
things like that, I'm just saying. So like, it's more than just one
Mm-hmm.
street, because if we do one, I'm sure we'll do others. But
Well, that's,
we can
And I
identify.
do like the underground nature of people just kind of closing their blocks,
I mean,
the
sometimes you
night
can
of
have
trick or
block
treat,
parties.
I think that's great, and
At
I
that
think
time.
people can trick or treat at night. Like my son goes out and trick or treats at night in some of
Yeah.
those blocks. So, but yeah, I think this is one of those big sort of, I don't know how big of an issue, but I do see it as being sort of a really potentially safety hazard. And I'd hate to see something happen right in
Yeah.
front of my house.
so for the next community and business relations, if we could have maybe a little bit longer than 30 minutes, just because
Yeah.
we'll have
This is
fire-
just a starting point.
Yeah, yeah,
because I didn't know
we'll
where
have
to go.
fire and police, having fire, police and DPW as part of the conversation in the beginning. And maybe it's only ever Morris, right? Maybe we discuss Morris as the first one and see how it goes. But having an hour-long meeting in the not too distant future, so we could just to discuss what it would take and how it would look, and if it's even feasible to close, say, starting with Morris and going from there. I mean, I don't want to speak for everybody, and maybe Morris is much easier than we think, and we can try to tackle an additional block during the committee meeting, but that's what I would like. Start a conversation.
Yeah.
If it works, great. If it doesn't work, then say we tried.
Yep. Agree.
Okay, so in summary, I'm hearing the focus is Morris and having that review done with PD and fire, public works to see what would or could be feasible.
Yeah.
And you want to do that at the committee meeting.
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason. Yeah, why not?
Happy. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Anything else, Matt? Is there? Okay. Next item that comes to us was brought to us by Trustee Arndorfer regarding conceptual study for possible scenarios for various DPW sites. I know the trustee sent an email, part of the public record. Everyone got it. He's in budget and finance right now, so he can't be here. Some of the items that he brought up, I think where he's coming from, and I tend to agree, that we don't know what we don't know at DPW right now. So, there's been a lot of talk of having to move DPW to a completely different site, whether or not that includes a transfer station or not, what that might look like off-site, whether the site would ever be feasible without a transfer station back in Shorewood. And there's been discussions about additional housing units on that site. Would it be a larger structure? Would it be smaller? Would it be individual homes? I think we're just trying to get a sense of what we're looking at, because, at some point we're going to have to make some decisions here, right? So the place that I feel like I have the least amount of knowledge, and I think this is where Trustee Arndorfer is coming from, is that we don't know what we don't know about DPW. Is there a ton of remediation? I know that there's grading that would have to be done regardless. But that's sort of the genesis, and I'm kind of reading the bullet points from his email.
Yeah.
But, and I know that in the past, there's been discussion that people wouldn't want to tip their hand. Developers wouldn't want to tip their hand of what they would want to do there, or that they wouldn't want to go too far down the road with plans or anything like that without there being an RFP put out or what have you. But I think, and perhaps others agree that it's going to be pretty hard to make a decision about another site outside of Shorewood, or even within Shorewood at that site, without knowing what our actual
Mhm.
at the current DPWs. That's just trying to summarize what he
Yeah,
wrote.
I thought his email today was really helpful because what I read from gleaning it was no, he was not married to the concept of needing to ask developers for the proposal.
Right.
So if we were going to incorporate this within the scope of the project, I would include it with what we would do from a site analysis standpoint. And have, he, in his email narrowed out, 3 different options relative to units and development. That's information I would very much like to get on the site. And I think it's more helpful for you as a board to obtain that from an architect doing that kind of first round just concept on the site, as opposed to being presented with what something, what that site could handle from a developer.
Mhm.
It'll give you a benchmark or a baseline of which to build kind of our education and experience on it. So that way, at whatever type, in the future, if there is a proposal let for the site, there's context and learning and understanding from the group before that type of an activity would happen, if it happens. So in order to accomplish that, what I would be looking or seeking for from this group is similar to the other components of site analysis, right? Which are being worked on by Strand. We're currently waiting on We Energies because they're still doing their analysis with regards to the wall and the utilities. That's really the major point we're waiting for, is that I could either solicit 3 quotes just from architects who'd be able, there's plenty of people who do this, who'd be able to put together those concepts. Before I did, I would come back with you guys with just a short scope,
Mhm.
just explain what would be included in it to make sure we're on the same page, because it's conceptual.
Sure.
The other element, or we could go out with a formal RFP, but I do think that that would be overkill for what we're trying to accomplish here, which is really conceptual data that comes down to numbers and what we would need for a desktop exercise. So when I say that, I mean, okay, what does that many units mean? What does it mean from a taxable value? What does access look like? So that what those units generate or what doesn't get generated from the site. And just someone with that expertise, they do that. I just, having reached out to some developers today to have that discussion based upon, when I understood what he was requesting then from his email, I was like, oh, well, that's something we can get. But I really think it's more beneficial if the village get it, outside of working with the developer or anyone else on it. I think the other thing that it's going to be really helpful, for our discussion on is really to, vet out and discuss what we're willing to accept on the site should it become available for development. Because in concept, we can say, oh, there could be 100 units or 50 units or no units. But before you would ever want to let a proposal to talk about what you would want on the site, if that's something we came to, I'm going to need to know from the group, from a policy perspective, what we're willing to permit. Right. And so it kind of helps that understanding foundation block to have that next discussion with the group. So I don't know if my comments here were helpful. I felt his
Yeah.
explanation was much easier to understand, and that's something that I think would be really helpful for us as a group.
Ballpark, what's the cost?
Well, I'll find out. I'll
I
be
guess-
back with you.
Do you have any idea of what a range could be for something like this?
No.
Okay.
And I'm assuming that this is something that could run in conjunction with the rest of it. So we're not gumming up anything.
No, I would just
It's-
tack it onto the site analysis. We're not gonna have an engineer do it. We're gonna have an architect do it, right? And so,
I
I
think it's a
just,
great
what I'd
idea.
want to do is just come back to you and kind of narrow that scope a little bit.
Yeah.
But I want to keep it simple and direct. But I really think that there's value. And when I say architect, it's not because I'm looking, let me explain that. I'm not anticipating to see renderings or what a
No.
building look like. I'm talking to do that calculation of what by square footage fits within this.
This is a lot.
Yes.
This is what we could put on that lot.
Mhm.
This is what we would get from that lot in tax base,
Yeah.
that type of stuff.
And part of the issue that we have, right, because developers will ask, well, what's the zoning on that parcel?
Don't worry
Well,
about it.
it's institutional, right? So the future zoning, it's never going to be institutional if it's redeveloped unless we would redevelop it ourselves. But we already know what that could look like. We have the barrier entrance report that showed an example of what it could be with expanded room minus the transfer station. So I think this just kind of flips the turntable and, you know, kind of asks for the other element. But I think it'd be good.
I think it'd be a valuable
Mhm.
tool.
Are there any other things, Matt, sorry.
Well, I was
Question
just gonna
about
say,
that.
I think if somebody wants to submit a rendering as well, like, we shouldn't, I think we should be very open-ended to what we want.
Sure. You know, so when I first heard about the rendering comment, and you're right, there's nothing wrong with that. But I had to think back to when I first came to Shorewood, there were sometimes groups would solicit just concepts, right? A concept's always something we can take a look at. The reality is though, unless you can actually build it, you don't know. So in some of these circumstances, those concepts created a lot of controversy when they could have never developed in the way that they could. And so recognizing the site that we're on, and an example of this, you guys are probably more familiar with it than I am, but there were condominiums in Estherbrook Park proposed on Wilson Drive.
Oh.
Okay, so
I saw those backroom renderings.
yeah, so they would have never been able to I mean, the bottom line is
They were-
you couldn't construct something like that.
Right.
So in the situation, so that's just an example. I don't want to like create a situation with something like that in light of the fact that when we get our site analysis back, right, it's going to be the beginning steps of that site analysis. So we haven't done further soil borings on the site. We're kind of working our way from large questions and kind of narrowing the scope. So from a building perspective, whatever gets built on that site, two things really impact it, the dirt and the zoning. And it's particularly important in this parcel, giving just what we know already about the soils and the compaction and things that may need to take place. So I don't want to guess at what could be built there. But I do want to evaluate what, from a number standpoint, as we look at conceptually, here's 3.1 or so acres. This is, and then really, then we need to have a zoning discussion.
Do you know when we'll get some, preliminary site analysis as to what sort of cleanup would need to be done, or like how far along are
Well,
we on that?
Sure.
And the reason I ask is because, does it make sense to time it around when that comes available to us?
Strand is just waiting on We Energies, from my understanding, to finish their the general site analysis report, which then we'll review and then we'll take to a next step. But what I would do in this circumstance is I would put together a brief scope which covered the kind of the three options that Trustee Orndorfer had described. And then I would ask, I'd get some quotes and come back to you as soon as I could to say, okay, what does that timing look like, and explain, the feedback that I receive.
Okay.
But that I don't want, again, I'm not saying don't get a conceptual rendering.
You understand where she's coming
Yeah.
from with that?
When you know
Yeah.
better after like learning
Right.
from some experiences
Yeah.
in this community, you want to try to, I want your discussion to be productive.
Yeah,
We
wanna-
will make it abundantly clear, should we receive any conceptual and renderings,
Okay.
that they're
I don't even think that.
high in the sky.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't think about it either, right? But again,
Been around long enough to watch things grow on their own.
yeah. And you guys are you're a productive group, right? And we're clicking away at different things to try to figure out this puzzle. So
And
Do
with
you,
that,
do you need direction from us to move forward with the architect?
what I'm hearing from listening to your discussion is, number one, that you're, directing me to go, with a brief scope, obtain 3 quotes, come back to the group, the board, and just get the final blessing on moving that forward, in conjunction with the site analysis we're already doing. So it's just viewed as another component. But it would likely not be, it would be like an add-on to what Strand's doing, not included within the Strand report.
What, I may have missed this, what would be the timeline that you would put out there for the architectural sort of analysis?
Well, I'd start by asking how soon that could be
Okay.
done.
Okay.
So I think it's more so about availability because I don't think that they may want to, and if I were them, I'd want the strand information.
Mhm.
But then we'll go from there.
Well, based on the productivity level of this board and committee, I would entertain motions to adjourn. We've completed our mission.
So moved.
Second.
A motion and a second, all in favor?
I,
Aye. No discussion, no opposition. We stand adjourned at 7:26 for a 4-minute break.
good job.
Good evening. I'd like to call the meeting of the village board to order at 7:32. We have all trustees except for trustee Lynn and trustee Ursink, who are excused this evening. Has this meeting been publicly noticed?
The meeting has been properly noticed and posted according to law.
Thank you. I appreciate everyone's time, talent, and patience in advance as we conduct business this evening. We don't have any special orders of business, so we'll move on to the consent agenda. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Second.
Motion by trustee McGovern, seconded by trustee Kudo. Any discussion? Trustee Stokebrand?
I'd like to pull item B as in Betty.
All right, any other discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor of approving the consent agenda with the exception of 5B, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Items removed from the consent agenda. We have one item, 5B, consider committee of the whole and regular village board meeting minutes, December 16th, 2024. Trustee Stokebrand?
Yes, I just wanted to add under item, the village president, there was the ICC meeting. Thank trustee McGovern for his efforts. If we could just please add for writing and securing ICC support for financial assistance at the state level for lead service lines. And I
Would you
can
like to make a
submit that in
motion?
writing if you want.
Yes.
Make it clear what he did.
Mhm. Would you like to make a
And
motion then?
with that, I move approval of the minutes.
Second.
Okay, motion by trustee Stokebrand, seconded by trustee Kudo. Any discussion? All those in favor of approving the minutes of December 16th with the requested change, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carries. There are no public hearings this evening. The next item is item 8, citizens to be heard. This is for this item is for matters not on the agenda. Are there any people in attendance this evening who would like to be heard on a matter not on the agenda? I'm going to look to the Zoom platform since we do not have any members of the public in attendance in person. All right, I am not seeing any hands or anyone coming off mute. So we will move on to item 9, new business. 9A, consider award of contract for Phase 1 2025 street lighting replacement. This item comes to us after a lot of discussion and preparation from Director Bushlick. It's been presented in our packet. I'm hoping that all the trustees have had time to review and submit any technical questions. But at this time, I will ask if there are any questions for staff and or a motion. Trustee Stokebrand?
I believe we discussed this briefly at the last meeting, but I just wanted to confirm that we will not have any money from the new street light fee for probably many months, but finance is confident. I didn't see with the start date is here that we've got the cash flow to make this happen. If we approve this now, are we looking at how soon it would start?
We would have sufficient funds available because we'll be borrowing for the expense of the construction.
And so what is that bond? When are we doing that bonding?
You're going to have a resolution at the January 22nd meeting and should have proceeds, and Christina, you can correct me, at the beginning of March. Oh, David, you're here. Middle March. Thank you.
And so this project would start, was there a start date in here? No. Typically, construction starts April 1. Is that what we'd be thinking?
We don't yet have a schedule from the contractor, but I can't really imagine a scenario that we would have a pay request prior to April 1.
Okay, and then I was also just trying to get a grip on geographically where this is in the village.
It's in the far northwest area of the village. I apologize. I should have put a map in the memo. There is a map on the website.
And do we need any kind of a public communication plan for this? Is a big deal.
We will follow the standard communication plans that we use for every other infrastructure project, which includes an mailed invitation to a public information meeting. There will be a project website that will be regularly updated. We will do the weekly notify me email blasts for those who sign up. Any specific property impacts that we anticipate to occur because of the construction, we typically use door notices to identified properties. I don't anticipate that being a thing with the streetlight program. I think impacts to driveways or access will be rare.
And is Lake Drive included in this?
No, it's northwest area of the village.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, what's the schedule from completion to conclusion of this phase?
We don't have the schedule from the contractor as of yet, but I would expect it, typical construction season, spring to fall.
Thank you.
And have we used this contractor before that they're recommending?
We have not.
But we've never replaced all of our streetlights before, so
That is correct.
thank
A lot
you.
of firsts, a lot of firsts. All right, is there a motion? Trustee Stokebrand,
I move the award of a contract for the Phase 1 street lighting replacement to Alcon Construction LLC in the amount of $1,693,771.64.
I would like to second that with gusto. I
Uh,
prefer to this moving ahead.
duly noted. Motion by trustee Stokebrand and a robust second by trustee Kudo. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. We have begun.
That's very exciting.
Mhm.
Huge.
All right, moving on to consider utilization of Pt1 extension funds for infrastructure improvements to improve the housing stock. So this comes to us, the presenter is the village manager. However, it comes to us with a recommendation from the Budget and Finance Committee. And a very comprehensive memo with 3 possible motions. So at this time, I would ask village manager, do you have anything to add or anything that you want to highlight? All right. Trustee Stokebrand, is there anything as chair of the committee that you would like to provide for the rest of the board?
No, I guess there was some discussion about leaving some flexibility, and that although it doesn't really reflect it, there was a concern that saying we wanted the money to be used for the improvement of housing stock would remove it from affordable housing. But I guess I had the opposing vote. On that, I would just say, in looking at the legislation, clearly the lawmakers provided like a pressure valve, right? And so they're like, if you decide you want to use this all for affordable housing, we're going to give you another way to use it if the whole thing doesn't work exactly as, for affordable housing in one definition, we're going to give you an option to use it in another way, then that is to improve the housing stock. And so the reason that I brought this forward was just because of our astonishing infrastructure costs that we did not know about, having been on the CDA when this passed and the village board when it passed. I would say the financial landscape has changed. And the other thing is the context of the 6.77% property tax levy increase. Residents are now paying a $30 wheel tax to the county and to the village. And we've added a street lighting charge. But that's not the most important thing to me. The most important thing to me is that this provides us an opportunity to add money, put money towards a problem of getting lead out. And that is the highest priority for me right now, is removing the lead from our water system and, the water mains, improving those, considering a suburb just north of us had a water main failure and a sinkhole again. And so that's the bigger, obviously the cost is very significant. But the other thing is that the state legislature gave us an option to use this creatively. And considering the situation that we've got with our lead, excuse me, I'm in favor of this.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, the other is Trustee Arndorfer and Trustee Lynn are the other two members of the committee. Trustee Arndorfer, is there anything that you'd like to provide for?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with, I guess broadly, I agree with what Trustee Stokbrand laid out. I think we agreed on motion option 1. I continue to reserve 100% of the additional increment collected from the mentioned for affordable housing. We agreed to motion option 1 because because that does not preclude using that 25% from further uses, but we just did not agree on a way in which we wanted to use that money at that time for a purpose different from what it was originally intended, let's say. So, I mean, but that said, we did recognize that as we look at, some of the infrastructure issues that we'll be addressing, it may make sense to tap that, and given that there's no impediment to changing course on that, we just decided to stick with option 1.
Mhm.
A very roundabout explanation, sorry.
No, it's helpful to have the background of the committee discussion. Is there any time sensitivity on this? Like, do we have to take action tonight? Because I'm realizing there are 2 members excused this evening, and I feel like this is a pretty big decision.
No time sensitivity that I'm aware of. I would just ask that if you don't take action tonight and are defer it, that you just let me know what date you'd like to defer to.
Right.
I mean, no, I'm sorry. I mean, that was we did ask staff that very quick, but I mean, there's no special procedure or process we need to undertake if we're going to use funds in this manner. It's just, there's no special key to unlock it as it were. So we didn't see any need to make a decision at that point in time, knowing that we could pivot as needed. Does that help?
Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking with the attendance at the board this evening, I'd prefer to defer it
got it.
until we have 7 members
Yeah.
here. So if I mean, would the body entertain a motion to defer at this time?
My concern is that staff needs to know before we go into the long-range financial plan, if we're putting $500,000 into lead service laterals in 2026. And the other thing is, down the road, I'm sure everyone could see here, we saved the village over $250,000 in interest. And so, I guess I can vote to defer, but this is something that we need to know before so staff can work on the long-range financial plan, and $500,000 is significant.
If we defer it to the second meeting in January, does that interfere with that timeline?
No, in fact, I was going to suggest I would just list it for the next meeting. We were unaware that trustee Lynn was going to be unavailable, as well as trustee, trustee
Bursting.
Bursting tonight. So yeah, we can list it on the 22nd and go from there.
I would make a motion to defer until the next meeting.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
The video screen is frozen for those of us watching from home.